All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to start by thanking the Tax Justice Network for the invitation. It's a pleasure and honor and privilege to be here with all of you these past 2 days. I'd like to start mentioning what I'm doing. I am pursuing my PhD. I'm in the midpoint of my doctoral work. I'm working on the international payment system, so what I like to call the plumbing of how the money flows around the world. And of course, that means understanding very well how the international correspondent banking system works and systems such as SWIFT, the messaging system through which money flows are communicated. And in the international correspondent banking system, offshore banks have a specific importance, because they tend to be, as we have been seeing all these past 2 days, central nodes in the functioning of the modern financialized global economy. The offshore banks specifically are the places, the sort of places where the liquidity that results from the profit shifting, the price transfers, the illicit financial flows end up being deposited. Therefore, it's the quid pro quo of all the sort of accrual system that we analyze when we calculate tax. The liquidity is the counterparty to that, and that's why I focus on that issue. Now, I have proposed a ranking of offshore banks. This is a part of my research, like I mentioned, for my doctoral work. Now, as we all know and we have seen, I don't know if you can help me with that. Doesn't. Okay. All right. So while we get the presentation in order. Okay, as we all know, we have ranked jurisdictions with, I think, very good efforts in the past decade or so. We had the Financial Secrecy Index, the Corporate Tax Haven Index released a few weeks ago. And I think these are excellent efforts in terms of pinpointing where the geographical locations are for where the offshore activity takes place and the illicit financial flows takes place. However, for example, the Financial Secrecy Index shows the jurisdictions where secrecy takes place and the financial flows takes place, but this is only the description of the criminogenic environment. Now, criminogenic behavior, which are the players, the market players that are acting in it, don't necessarily have to be justified by a criminogenic environment. So the jurisdictions with their laws, their policies, and so on, create the criminogenic environment, but the criminogenic behavior is performed by the actual market players, by the enablers, which is the main topic of this conference. So it's important to also try to describe with an index or with a ranking the market players who are these actors that are actually incurring in the behavior. The Financial Secrecy Index has as one of its pillars banking secrecy ranking as well. And again, if we were to use that, we would again have a ranking of jurisdictions, which is important, but it does not take us yet to the market players. Another element that's very important when discussing offshore banks has to do with the role of information and communications technology. So basically, in the 90s and after the 90s, in the early 2000s, the internet has allowed for offshore banks. We used to have a much larger, you could call it wholesale business for large actors. now be able to reach retail clients, right? So now basically anybody can open an offshore account because you can do everything online. And this was predicted by a Cato publication in the early 90s that said, internet will allow people to start moving the funds offshore in a much easier manner because it will become sort of a retail banking business as well. Now with cryptocurrencies and so on, that's even another level, but I won't get into that today. Now, for doing this, I tried looking up, is there already an offshore banking ranking somewhere? And of course, what you can find online is a bunch of these type of websites that promote offshore bank accounts with a list of offshore banks, but not really a ranking in terms of whether they're safe or not, they're reliable or not, or any sort of indication whatsoever. But what was interesting was that these directories do sort of set a path in terms of what type of information is available out there. As you would expect, some of these websites are ephemeral. A bunch of them are already not online, so I had to go to the Wayback Machine to access them. The Cayman Islands Monetary Authority has a report that they publish every year where they say this is the prime banking offshore centers that they themselves compare themselves to, okay? So basically these 8 jurisdictions with over or approximately 1,000 banks are what they themselves consider to be comparable jurisdictions where offshore banking in the pattern that the Cayman Islands banks operate. So as you can see here briefly, the number of banks that have been operating in these jurisdictions has decreased substantially over the last 5-6 years, but of course there's still plenty of them. The problem is, so we have here a macroeconomic reading of the role of the offshore banking system with the BIS data. In the first column, you will see the deposits, cross-border deposits in the jurisdictions by the residents of the banks. In the second one, by the national ownership of the banks. And in the third column that you can't see, unfortunately, because of the slides problems, you have the share of deposits in nationally owned banks over the total of deposits in that jurisdiction. And for example, the Cayman Islands is only 2%. So only 2% of the business that takes place supposedly in the islands actually takes place in Cayman banks or Cayman-owned banks, which shows the degree of transnationalization of these offshore jurisdictions. Now, that's why I decided to focus for the first version of this ranking on the Cayman banks, the Cayman banks. As you can see in the last paragraph, I'm going to go a bit faster, the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority themselves, they say, look, we have banks that don't have to have physical presence in the islands, and of those banks, only 265 people work in the islands, but over 3,000 work outside of the Cayman Islands. So if we were talking about significant economic activity or presence and so forth, this is a clear admission that these are shell banks in disguise. Now, to build this ranking, I had a lot of problem accessing information. So I started to research why is there no information. And one of the most disappointing things that I found was even though the IMF created an offshore center assessment program in the year 2000, because they have macroeconomic global significance, in 2008, the IMF eliminated this assessment program of the offshore centers, arguing that it would generate stigma for the offshore centers, for those jurisdictions. That was one of the reasons why the IMF decided to shut down the program, which was specifically designed to upgrade their standards. So a very similar Potemkin village type situation, okay? And I won't go into too many details, but basically we have 11 variables that I used as proxies because the information is simply not there. I can't find the balance sheets, the financial statements are not published. Orbis only has statements for 8 out of the 133 banks that operate in the islands, 8 out of the 133 islands, banks in the islands. So these are all proxies that I use to measure the size and the opacity of the banks, including, for example, their presence in so-called blacklists like the IRS's Foreign Financial Institutions or Facilitator list. And this is basically the result of the investigation. These are the usual suspects, the world's largest mega banks that are also qualified as global too big to fail banks that are the largest and most opaque institutions operating in the Cayman Islands. The full ranking is available in the paper that will be shared with you. So just to briefly, 2 quick lessons. The usual suspects are there. And the second one, there needs to be much better information. And of course, the details on how to get there are explored in the paper. Thank you.